Добрий день.
Good afternoon. We start our working day at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and the topic for today is Anti-Corruption Action Center opens online anti-corruption reform tool. And our speakers are Daryna, Kaleniuk, Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, Hopko, People's Deputy of Ukraine, Chairman of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Foreign Affairs. And later we will be joined by Serhiy Leshchenko, People's Deputy of Ukraine, faction Petro Poroshenko Bloc, member of the Committee of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on Corruption Prevention and Counteraction. Welcome. Good morning. Today we are going to present our material in English.
Online tool to measure the implementation of anti-corruption conditionalities of Ukraine. The reason we did that is that because almost every single foreign partner of Ukraine asks Ukraine to deliver measurable results in fight with corruption. Anti-corruption reform of the government became even top priority topic for the most recent visits of very high top officials of the NATO, of the US State Department, and will likely be one of the focus of the discussions for the upcoming summit. And we would like this discussion not to be very vague, but to be very precise. Foreign partners of Ukraine started to condition Ukraine to deliver very measurable steps starting back in 2014. So it was not about just simple Ukraine fight with corruption. It was about demanding very precise steps. There are many donors supporting Ukraine, but key donors who conditioned their support to anti-corruption reform described in details is IMF and EU. IMF through their multi-billion loan program, which was opened in 2014, and the EU through three mechanisms: through the EU Visa-Liberalization Action Plan, through EU microfinancial assistance worth of 1.8 billion euro, 600 million out of this 1.8 to be disbursed by the end of the year, still, if Ukraine will implement some reforms, including anti-corruption, and the EU state building contract worth of 355 million euro. So Ukraine received a lot of financial support for making reforms. And anti-corruption was one of the key reforms linked to this support. What we did, we highlighted in the one web page all detailed conditionalities which were presented into these official documents of cooperation between Ukraine and foreign donors. We grouped them into four main clusters, four main groups. The first one, and probably the most important for foreign donors, are conditionalities about corruption investigation and prosecution. And here, almost all donors and EU and IMF in all their documents, they decided that Ukraine has to set up the new investigative anti-corruption agency. It was created, this agency, it is National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Donors also were very specific with what kind of guarantees of independence should this National Anti-Corruption Bureau have. And here we see at the web page that these are separate conditions: selection of NABU director through a transparent way, separate funding and high salaries for NABU, external audit of NABU, exclusive jurisdiction of NABU, various investigative powers of NABU. So all that were separate conditionalities specifically in the IMF requirements. Apart from establishment of NABU, there are still conditionalities to establish specialized anti-corruption prosecution and anti-corruption court. So while anti-corruption prosecution is already established, anti-corruption court is still not even in the law. Another groups of anti-corruption conditionalities are related to corruption prevention And here, almost everything is focused on electronic asset declaration of public officials and the proper system of verification of these asset declarations. This was one of the key conditionalities of the EU prior granting visa-free regime. And disregarding that visa-free regime was granted, but verification system of asset declaration didn't start yet. Another group is about opening up information and giving access of publics, of society, of civil society, of journalists to who owns what in Ukraine. So here we have all possible state registries being opened, including the first public register of beneficial ownership in the world. And we have a quite extensive reform of the public procurement in Ukraine, which actually went far beyond the requirements of foreign donors of Ukraine. This is probably only one case where we were not required to go so far, but we went even farther than it was required. Asset recovery group of conditionalities, which is also linked to corruption investigation and prosecution. So key goal for asset recovery is actually to deprive criminals and corrupt officials from ill-gotten funds. Therefore, there were requirements to improve asset recovery legislation and to set up a separate asset recovery and asset management agency. So this is a brief summary what was required and what was implemented actually. We have counted that out of these 35 very specific requirements linked to anti-corruption, 20 were being implemented. So we have to give credit to the state that 60% of anti-corruption conditionalities were implemented. Why they were implemented, this is another story. They were implemented not because of the sincere political will of the president, of the government, of the majority of the parliament. They were implemented specifically because they were specific. And they were prior action conditionality of the IMF, they were conditionalities before granting visa-free regime, and foreign partners of Ukraine were very tough on them, as well as civil society. So our organization, as well as our partners, we conducted dozens of direct action events, protests in front of the parliament. We conducted huge communication campaign explaining complex messages and complex problems with simple messages. We explained complex solutions with simple messages, including why NABU director has to be selected with an independent, transparent selection commission, including why e-declarations have to be launched. So 60% is the credit not only to the government of Ukraine, but also to the foreign partners and to the civil society. But what is the reason why we launched this instrument right now? As 3 years past this first conditionalities appeared. Since the last probably 3-4 months, we are observing attempts to roll back the reforms and roll back even the progressive achievements, including the e-declarations registry, including the independence of National Anti-Corruption Bureau. In parallel to that, international and foreign partners of Ukraine, they are losing their leverage because they already gave up almost all of the carrots. And I'm talking about EU, first of all, because EU gave visa-free regime, granted visa-free regime. EU already granted 1.2 billion euro direct microfinancial assistance, 600 million euro yet to be disbursed by the end of the year. If Ukraine will not get it this year, and if Ukraine will not implement reforms required in these documents, we will lose opportunity to get this 600 million euros. So it's still leverage, but it's tiny comparable to what was given. And IMF disbursed more than 15 billion loans in the last 3 years, and a few billion yet to be given to Ukraine but it's not very big amount. Probably Ukrainian officials think that they can live without that. Therefore, we decided that there is a need for the civil society online monitoring and measurement tool to make in one place all the list of anti-corruption conditionalities which were started back in 2014, but which still matter. Because anti-corruption conditionalities of foreign donors, this is not only about making laws, it's about implementation. And now we are at the most crucial phase of implementing anti-corruption reform. And now we are on the phase where negative results of this anti-corruption reform are being felt by public officials. So anti-corruption reform starts to deliver results. And therefore, it became painful for those in power who are corrupt and who are resisting and who are willing to destroy all of that. And they might say, we've got visa-free regime, we've got all IMF loans, why should we continue? Let's destroy NABU by independent auditor, let's actually waive some agencies from the need to submit asset declarations. So therefore, this webpage is not static. It will have regular monthly updates about risks, about changes, and about achievement. So while 60% is delivered, 40% yet has to be delivered. And this 40%, or more than 1/3 of anti-corruption conditionalities, was linked to support which we already received. So this is what we owe in the past. So I will be finishing now with highlighting what are key priorities and where are key problems. The next key priority is establishment of the Anti-Corruption Court. As you might notice this in the left corner, it is marked with red. The court, there are already draft laws in the parliament, but the court is not established. These laws are not voted. Serhiy will describe in more details why Anti-Corruption Court needed and when we can hope for the Anti-Corruption Court. We regularly witness attacks on NABU, specifically regarding appointment of the external auditor. 3 auditors can dismiss NABU director already in August. It is important to have auditors who have experience in investigation corruption abroad. This is the requirement of the IMF. Unfortunately, so far, the Cabinet of Ministers appointed a person who doesn't have such experience, which is direct violation of the foreign conditionality. Wiretapping for NABU. Another important tool which is needed for NABU to be independent and to protect the investigations from leaking to other law enforcement agencies. NABU cannot wiretap without security service knowing whom they are wiretapping. Verification of beneficial ownership information. We have registry of beneficial ownership, but information there is not verified and there are no sanctions for false statements. And the biggest problem I see, actually, in corruption prevention. National Corruption Preventive Commission discredited itself, absolutely. And if you click on this web page, you will see there in details with all chronology how it happened. E-declarations registry is positioned as a huge success story. It is a huge success story, but there are already rollbacks. Security Service of Ukraine decided that we are not going to submit asset declarations into this registry. We create our parallel system. Military prosecutors decided we are not going to declare our assets there. We want to protect ourselves. And these are people and these are agencies where there is huge risk of grand corruption. E-declarations verifications and conflict of interest verification was not started at all. It was started, but not a single asset declaration was verified since October last year. Conflict of interest verification already started, but without proper regulation. rules of regulations which had to be adopted with an NAPC, which causes selective approach into the conflict of interest regulations. So we see a danger that NAPC can soon turn into the selective prosecution and investigation agency, which will be used to intimidate opponents of the current regime. So I'm finishing now, and I'm giving the word to the head of the anti-corruption, to head of not yet anti-corruption committee, but the head of the Committee of Foreign Affairs. Please, Hanna.
Thank you, Daria. Good morning, everybody, dear journalists, dear representatives of the embassies. I think that this is crucially important to have such important tools that Anti-Corruption Center developed, because through this online monitoring, everybody, especially I hope MPs, will be encouraged to do more and to speed up the process of passing a new legislation or providing amendments. So the first and key messages within this 3 and almost 4 years after the dignity revolution started, we managed, as Daria mentioned, to fulfill 60% of obligations. But the key question for now is how to guarantee that the process of reforms are irreversible and sustainable, and to avoid the rollback from different corrupted people in different parties, different branches of power, because they are not interested in effective and efficient work of NABU. Just recent case when NABU together with FBI worked together and brought to the parliament this submission of taking off the immunity from one MP, Mr. Rosenblatt, and another. So this is just a very good case how NABU could prevent, to stop corrupted people. And this Thursday will be a test day for Ukrainian parliament for different factions. Either there is political will to fight with corruptionists or not. We will see how the parliament will vote for taking off this immunity out from 6 MPs. And thanks to the pressure from civil society, from international, it seems like now we see how the position of different members of parliament are changing more in the favor to support and to support these 6 cases. Also, these 3 last days is crucially important for Ukraine because top-ranking officials, State Secretary Tillerson, General Secretary of UN, Mr. Guterres, and General Secretary Mr. Stoltenberg visited Ukraine together with the North Atlantic Council. And if you analyze all the statements, you could see like the key red line or messages. Like if you want, so the doors for NATO is open, but you have to first meet the standards of NATO. You have to focus on corruption. This is the key. And also you have to modernize the armed forces, but corruption, corruption, corruption. So it was like a key message that you have to continue your fight, your prevention, your investigation on corruption cases. Also, yesterday we were talking in the parliament on energy diplomacy, on energy security, and about Nord Stream 2. And if you analyze 264 cases that NABU now is considering, 264, so the half of them goes to energy sector as the most corrupted, that brought the billions of dollars to people involved in energy sector. So I would like to say thank you, Daria, and her team for developing this important tool. And also I think that to make anti-corruption reforms irreversible, it's crucially important to continue pressure from civil society. It's important from our partners to be more direct, talking about the need to fight corruption even more effective. And also it's important to protect, because within these 3 years and a half we established strong anti-corruption institutions, and NABU is one of the key. And now we see different attempts, and with Serhiy and many others we already defended different amendments that were directed to weaken the position of NABU. And also as a co-author with another members of parliament like Igor Sobolev to introduce wiretapping for NABU. We've seen the big sabotage within the parliament, how political representatives are afraid of giving NABU wiretapping, knowing that this will be another instrument of effective instrument of fighting corruption. And it's really important that upcoming summit, Ukraine-EU summit, then in November we will see EU Eastern Partnership Summit. I think that it's important on all levels to continue talking about results of anti-corruption activities, because consideration or even cases, sometimes we see that this is more like PR of some representatives of General Prosecutor Office, how they submit in different cases, but then we see that these cases are not properly prepared. So this is why it's the professionalism, the financial independence, no political influence. This is the key that there is important that we have to deliver, making our anti-corruption institution, Agency on Prevention Corruption, really independent financially, without political influence, and with FBI and other institutions to make them even more efficient. I'll stop here because, and thanks again, and I think that this is really important after visa-free regime, after association agreement with Ukraine, with EU and Ukraine. It's important to think about the new flagship program for Ukrainians, for political elites that could unite, and on the other hand will provide like a new criteria that we will be obliged to meet, and this will be another like internal motivation to work harder and not to allow the rollback of all the achievements. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. Actually, I want to emphasize that the EU, after granting visa-free regime, decided that there will be post-visa liberalization action plan monitoring, which will ensure that changes are irreversible. So we are expecting for the detailed regulation of this monitoring from the EU. While EU is developing the regulation, we already have the tool from the civil society to monitor these reforms. I'm giving the floor now to Serhiy Leshchenko, and I would like to ask Serhiy, what are the hopes for the anti-corruption court establishment, as this is the, we said A, establishing National Anti-Corruption Bureau investigative agency, we said B, establishing specialized prosecution, but no convictions and confiscations without the court willing to hear these cases. Please, Serhiy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. My personal opinion that, as for today, the room is very limited. It's a very small chance to establish anti-corruption court now, because first we're going toward electoral campaign, and as close we go, as less the chance to implement anti-corruption measures, because nobody wants on the top to see their cronies in criminal investigation or in the court just on the eve of electoral date. So chance is very limited. Second, because we lost this very influential and very effective carrot, which means visa liberalization. It's true that 90% of reforms in Ukraine during the last 3 years were adopted because it was part of conditionalities, even more than visa liberalization, than IMF program. And as for today, we see that there is no another important carrot in these relations of stick and carrot, when Ukrainian leadership can be pushed to implement, to vote for some reforms, to establish some agencies, because it will be part of conditionalities for visa liberalization. I know it from my personal experience because I was the main sponsor of law on political finance. When political finance law was adopted as a part of visa liberalization, and when political parties could have a chance to get money from state budget, and this law was voted by parliament, this very unpopular law, because in theory this law will cut links between oligarchs and political parties. This law was voted just because it was part of visa liberalization program. As for today, what we have to protect our achievements. I think this is the really threat to have a sliding back process during the next 2 years, because next year is going to be electoral campaign, and for Ukrainian leadership it's very important to limit the chance of high-rank investigation against presidential cronies or cronies of parliamentary leadership on the very close days before election happens. So regarding anti-corruption court, I don't believe for successful resolution of NABU cases in our regular courts, because our regular courts are corrupt totally. And if you come to the court, you can see how it works. I know some embassies send their representatives to the court to be observers during different process, and you can see how manipulated this process is. So in this situation, when we have very biased judicial system, the only way to avoid cleaning of corrupt individuals through Ukrainian judicial system is to establish something new one. The idea of prosecutor general is completely different. Not to establish something new one, but to reform current judicial system by the way of establishing special anti-corruption branch. I believe it's totally wrong, because all our experience during the last 3 years shows that only new brand bodies can be successfully reformed, can be successfully anti-corruption and transparent, like Anti-Corruption Bureau, like new road police. If we're starting to reform something from inside, it's, you know, it's like a way to deadlock, because nothing gonna be changed during 3 years as it was happened with General Prosecutor Office. 3, even 4 prosecutor generals announced reform of GPO, nothing happened. So in our situation, we have not to accept the way proposed by leadership, then we have to establish just small anti-corruption branch in current judicial system. We have to push toward the total implementation of conditionalities of IMF and implementation of this anti-corruption roadmap, when totally independent anti-corruption court has to be established by Ukrainian law. It's under current Ukrainian legislation. This current legislations say we have to have separate anti-corruption court system in Ukraine. Thank you very much, and thank you for your excellent work done for protection of anti-corruption institutions in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have no time for the questions right now, but if you want to ask questions to our dear speakers, you can do it offline. Thank you, everyone.